He's the author of Ant Farm, which I guess is sort of like Animal Farm, a novel of what's bugging society. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
Where are we calling you from?
Well, I usually am based out of Los Angeles, California, but right now I'm visiting family up in Toronto, Canada. So it's quite cold up here.
Yeah, well, come to Colorado. The high is going to be 6 today.
Oh, my.
Amazing.
Yeah, I've certainly been to Colorado in the winter, yeah.
It's a beautiful place, and the weather is tremendous a lot of the time, but there's a part of the winter where it gets challenging, but that's, it's a privilege to live here. Stephen, tell us a little bit about your book, Ant Farm.
Sure. I think the easiest way to describe it to people in a nutshell is to say that it's a fictional but familiar story about a free society that deteriorates into a totalitarian society. And you were quite right in your comparison at the beginning to Orwell's Animal Farm. That was my intention, to make a similarly structured book, but with a very different philosophy, a philosophy about how freedom works and control just really causes all kinds of problems.
And then do you see a parallel with the United States today?
Absolutely. It's not meant just as a metaphor for how things are going in the United States. There are lots of different countries around the world that are following a similar pattern, but certainly comparisons can be drawn to the U.S. Absolutely. Wow.
And what it does seem that all we do is go for more and more government control. Are there any societies out there going for less and less? I mean, I know incrementally small changes, but large ones are kind of going, yeah, we really need less government. That doesn't seem to be a trend.
It's certainly not a trend. In certain areas of government, you do see, like you said, incremental changes for the better with fewer government controls. Hong Kong is a good example where things are still relatively free economically. New Zealand is another good example. There's a couple of think tanks that publish a list every year of economic freedom indexes. Now, those don't really reflect social freedoms too much, but economically, unfortunately, the U.S. keeps getting further and further down that list. It really used to be a beacon of freedom, and it's not so much the case anymore, unfortunately.
Wow. So who's number one on that list, if you can recall?
I can't recall, unfortunately. I know that both Hong Kong and New Zealand are closer to the top, but again, it's hard to say if that's because they're becoming more free or other places are becoming less free. It's difficult to say.
Yeah. Hong Kong has managed to stay out of the claws of communist China, but that you see all those protests and democracy demonstrations. It doesn't sound like they feel like the future necessarily is going to be more free. It looks like China's going to probably try to slowly rein them in more and more, which will probably kill the economic divisions of society. Well,
you're probably right.
What do you think about this outlay to Cuba of the president? I must admit, I'm sort of mixed. One, I don't like when the government tells us, no, you can travel here, but you can't travel there, because if it's true of Cuba, they can make it the rest of the world too. But talk about an unfree society.
Holy
cow. I mean, Cuba, they've got a 5% internet use, the lowest, they say, in the world. I mean, what a horrible society it really is. I mean, I think a lot on the left still think of Fidel Castro in the San Madre Mountains fighting the corrupt Batista or something, but they have taken an incredibly prosperous island who had, wide disparities of wealth and turned it into a hellhole. And now Barack Obama say, oh, this will be great.
Yeah.
You give us one back prisoner and everything else. So I'm kind of conflicted on it. What are your thoughts?
Well, I understand your feeling of being conflicted. I certainly do. I'm not as conflicted, although I agree with much of your sentiment. It's certainly not a government. The Cuban government is not a government I support, obviously. They're very restrictive and very oppressive to their people, and their people suffer as a result. But at the same time, I agree with the first thing you said, which is the U.S. government should not be telling people within the U.S. borders where they are allowed to travel and where they're not allowed to travel, and where they can do business and where they can't do business. I think it's up to each individual to decide for themselves. And certainly if you feel that you're supporting Cuba with your dollars would lead to bad things, then you should be free to say, no, I don't want to do that. But to other people that might have a different opinion, whether it's right or wrong, they may have another opinion as to how their money may be able to help the Cuban people, and I think they should be able to. They should be allowed to spend their money there. Nanny states shouldn't be telling everybody what they can and cannot do.
Yeah, I mean, people often think that once we lift the embargo, Cuba will just prosper. And the answer is that we haven't boycotted, we haven't surrounded. I mean, the rest of the world trades with Cuba today. Mexico trades with Cuba, Canada trades, Europe, and in fact, there isn't a lot of opportunities for investment because the government doesn't really want to lift its control of the people. And so while, they'll sell more cigars and some other things, there's very little money in Cuba, so they won't be importing much from the United States. And yes, they'll have more tourists, but they don't want too much of that either. I mean, I had a friend who traveled to Cuba recently, and they said they're really restricted to where you could go. You were kind of, okay, you can stay on these beaches, and you can kind of travel a little bit downtown, but God, don't go to the interior of the country or something, because then other people, the poor Cuban people will see that there's some hope out there.
Yeah, listen, it's true. I mentioned at the top of the hour, I'm back in Canada for the holidays, and Canada is one of those countries where there's no restriction on travel to Cuba. Now, I never traveled to Cuba. I hold a U.S. passport, and there were some concerns when I was growing up, but I knew other people, Canadians, that did go there, and they said, yes, things were terrible in Cuba for the people. However, the small amount of money that they were able to spend on tourism, sort of under the table, just cash tips to people, really made a difference in these poor people's lives. Now, I don't know if those people were later dragged out and killed. Who knows for sure? But certainly you hope not, and you hope that just small amounts of glimmers of free markets will be enough to inspire people, and maybe with the right amount of time, turn things around. I know it seems unlikely, but certainly keeping that country closed off and changing nothing is not the answer either.
Well, they're going to keep it closed off. I mean, Raul Castro and those who prosper in any society, the more equal animals live, an okay lifestyle in Cuba, and they plan to keep on living an okay lifestyle in Cuba, and they don't plan to let anybody else get in on their deal, and they're going to suppress anybody and everybody they possibly can, and doing it so for 50 years. There are not that many totalitarian regimes that have been successful in totally squashing any hope of people. And I think they've opened up a little bit, but, it's always a bad time when a country prevents its people from leaving. And whether it's East Germany or elsewhere, you know that that's not a very happy society when they're telling you. Because I was in Cuba in 1958 as a kid, and, enormous wealth and big disparity, but it is an incredibly vibrant place. And boy, I'm one of those people. I'm going to travel and go see the Cuba. I hope maybe I can go get away from the tourist beaches and see other parts of the island. I'm not sure they allow you to do that at all, or what massive kind of governmental approvals you have to get. But it will be a fascinating place to visit. But it's always amazing how. On the left side, how much they think Cuba is just a happy place, and now that we've lifted the embargo, it's going to be all set. But Fidel apparently is semi-senile. Raul is 83 years old, but both they certainly seem to have their thumb down on the country.
You're right. They certainly do. I mean, the only thing that can change a regime like that, I think, for the better, is internal change from the people. And certainly the more that people are inspired by free market concepts, the more likely that is to happen. Once you get a taste of freedom, most people don't want to give that up. They want more freedom. You know, you see this kind of thing even a little bit in North Korea. That's arguably the single most restricted country in the world.
Yeah, you're right. That beats out one of the few countries that beats out Cuba is North Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. But even there are thriving underground black markets where trade is being done with U.S. dollars. Stuff is getting smuggled into that country. So try as they may, the North Korean government can't keep everything out. And with time, as those seeds grow, of course, these people are going to be imprisoned. But you can't imprison everybody. Try as you may. You just can't. And the hope is that, and we've seen it before historically, that once people get a big enough taste of freedom, they want more, and things can eventually change, and peacefully at that, which is something I'd love to see in other countries like North Korea and Cuba. And I certainly think that lifting these trade embargoes is one way to at least encourage that, even if in a minuscule kind of way.
Yeah, well, that's probably true. I mean, you know, most people get free with the flow of blood to the Liberty Tree because those in charge do not want to simply give up their power, and so usually it isn't peaceful. But it can be. I mean, East Germany is an example, and the entire fall of the Soviet Empire is really extraordinary, and it's how little violence it was and how little blood was shed, and kind of freeing up a huge part of the whole world. So there is always hope. Can I keep you over the break? And I want to ask you about Rand Paul and how the libertarian movement is doing, and your comparison, and how optimistic you might be.
Absolutely. I'd love to stay with you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Stephen Aaron Gray is a leading libertarian, spokesman, activist, and author of Ant Farm, a novel about what's bugging society. Stephen, do you consider yourself a capital A libertarian or a small L libertarian?
Well, definitely not a capital A, and I even hesitate to use.
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't pick up on that either. I meant capital L. Yes, I'm certainly not capital L, and I even hesitate with lowercase l. The word libertarian is a little troubling for me. A lot of people probably would call me a libertarian. I don't like to call myself that because that word means different things to different people. If I say, hey, I'm a libertarian, person A is going to think I mean one thing, and person B is going to think I mean something else. And I just prefer to tell people that I'm very pro-liberty, and we can go issue by issue. I think people will find I always side in favor of liberty.
Okay, and of course liberty will have its own definition by lots of different people too. But Rand Paul, now he's an interesting politician. I mean, I had high hopes for Rand Paul when he came to office, and the first 6 months in office, you know, everything he says, and God, that's great. But I must admit, over the last year and a half, as he's kind of prepped himself for the presidential run, you know, I find myself agreeing with him less and less and less as he kind of has endless sister soldier moments. That's all he has, their sister soldier moments. What's your view on Rand and how he's doing?
I think my view is quite similar to yours, especially coming off the heels of his father. I also had high hopes, but I think he's still too much in favor of state solutions for me to really get behind him and support him. He'll say things that do sound very pro-liberty, but he also says things that sound very in favor of the state and very oppressive, and that concerns me. If he were to get into power, I'm not too sure that we'd see much change in favor of freedom, and that's upsetting.
Yeah, it is. As he heads out for his presidential run, I'm not sure he's going to run or not because they didn't take the Kentucky House. So that, in fact, you know, he can't run for both offices, and is he going to risk the presidential one while giving up his Senate seat? I think he's probably too used to the niceties of having a Senate seat and a big income and a big following to want to give all that potentially up for a run for the presidency, which he probably would not be necessarily much of a favorite. Who do you like out there? I mean, who's in your view, kind of on the pro-liberty side of the equation?
You know, unfortunately, I've really lost faith in the political system. I don't think that politicians who are in favor of liberty have much hope of getting into power and changing things. But that's not to say that I don't have hope for liberty in the future. There's other ways to attain liberty peacefully, as we discussed earlier on in the program. I think that people in large masses do hold certain voting power, and I think that also civil disobedience is a way to achieve more liberty without getting violent. I certainly think that violence is always going to be the wrong answer. The other thing I really like, even though its power has sort of diminished in the last 12 months, is the buying power of Bitcoin. That's using an alternative currency where the state doesn't really have any access and can't really tax you because of its anonymity. So I think just agorist and outside of the state solutions are one of the ways that people are going to be able to bypass state control. Certainly in areas where people band together to do this kind of thing, you're going to see more success than if you just try and go it alone in a large area with a lot of state control. But there certainly is hope. I just don't think much of that hope lies in the political sphere.
What's an example of a successful civil disobedience of the pro-liberty agenda you're talking about?
Well, the one that I'm always fascinated by, or the area I'm very fascinated by, is happening repeatedly in New Hampshire because of this movement called the Free State Project, where they're trying to get 20,000 very pro-liberty people to move to New Hampshire. And they've already had a lot of success. There's a couple of thousand already living there. And when there's a couple of thousand people living in a very sparsely populated region, they are able to do things that you wouldn't be able to do in a densely populated area. So if there's ever a victimless crime that happens, like, being caught with marijuana, which now, fortunately, in Colorado is not such a problem, but in other areas like New Hampshire or the rest of the country, with a couple of exceptions, it's still problematic. So if ever that happens, hundreds of people will go to the trial there and voice their disapproval. And eventually what you have is police feeling like they're going to be ostracized if they pursue that kind of thing. And so now, to my understanding, in New Hampshire, it's not as heavily prosecuted as it used to be, and that's not because the laws have changed. It's just because there's so many people there who cry out against it that it's just not. People aren't arrested for it as often as they used to be, and I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, well, probably in New Hampshire, there are a couple of thousand pro-liberty people, there are a couple of 100,000 people from Boston who commute now from New Hampshire as the city expands out, and so they're overwhelmed. I mean, New Hampshire doesn't seem to be getting more liberty-oriented, but more democratic every time you look at it these days.
You know, in many ways, you're right. They're not having all the success that they'd like, but they're certainly seeing some incremental success. That's actually one of the few areas where some political action has helped. There are a lot of people out there that call themselves libertarian that are getting into office. I think certainly there's more people, there's more so-called libertarians in office there than in most of the places in the country. And so another example I can think of that I was hearing about is that, well, first of all, it's the only state in the union where seatbelt laws aren't mandatory. And of course, I think wearing a seatbelt's a good idea, but again, I think that's a decision for each person to make on their own. And there was there was some legislation proposed to change that, and there were enough people that spoke out against it that it got blocked. So it's still the only state in the union that doesn't have mandatory seatbelt laws. These, of course, are just small victories, and there's other things that they're losing. But if they get all 20,000 people there, even though there are several 100,000 people there, 20,000 activists that are actively pursuing liberty can only be a good thing.
Yeah, well, there's a liberty movement there, or moving to New Hampshire. That's been going on for maybe a decade, half decade. I mean, it's not a new phenomenon. It seems to be, maybe we'll succeed. I mean, it'd be wonderful to see New Hampshire. When it was an agrarian economy, there was that live free or die kind of view. Now it's more of a suburb, and the suburbs don't produce necessarily the greatest libertarians or freedom people, but who knows? Well, yeah. What about Jeb Bush? What about our fine leading Republican candidate? What do you think of Jeb Bush?
I'm very skeptical of any positive change that he might bring. But listen, I'm willing to listen. I just haven't heard much from him that leads me to believe that he is in any way, shape, or form truly in favor of freedom. But hey, Jeb Bush, change my mind. I'm willing to listen.
Yeah, well, he'll tell you how wonderful Common Core is, and it's hard to see if you like less government. Common Core is a good thing for you. It's hard to view Jeb Bush as anything except somebody who likes, like his brother, he likes big government. He likes his own style of big government, but he still loves big government, and so it's not much of a liberty agenda when you got somebody who seems to love the bigness and what government can do for you.
Well, it's true. You're absolutely right. This is actually something I explore a lot in my book, Ant Farm, that you had mentioned, is that whether you're talking about Democrats or Republicans, usually you're in a situation where whether they're a Democrat or Republican, they want bigger government. It's just they want it in their own image, and they think, no, if we can just change government in ways X, Y, Z, things are going to be better. And I think often these people on both sides of the aisle are very well-intentioned. They do want things to be improved for people, but they just don't learn from history and see that it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. If you want to control more people's lives in various ways, it's just going to make things worse. The state doesn't have any accountability. The people have no power to say yes or no to these things once they're passed. It's just a terrible situation, and I really get into this a lot in Ant Farm with a variety of different issues, ranging from control on travel, which we talked about with Cuba, all the way down to gun rights, to taxation. It's really all the same thing, and I think a lot of people don't realize that. They think, they cheer for their team, whether it's Democrat or Republican, without realizing that at the end of the day, there's not much difference between the agendas of the two parties.
And what's your view on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
Gosh, in what regard?
Well, I mean, they're the biggest political player today. I mean, the Republican Party side. They support enormous candidates, but they seem to have an agenda which is just kind of crony capitalism, at least in my view, is crony capitalism. There's a difference. There's lots of forms of capitalism that aren't necessarily free market, and they're not big into free market. They're big into lobbying and getting, their big companies tax and regulatory breaks.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right on that. This is why I don't like to generally say that I'm in favor of capitalism, because again, like you said, many people, when you say capitalism, they think crony capitalism, which of course I'm not in favor for. The government should not be pulling any favors for any businesses. Markets should be completely free of government influence, because government influence at the end of the day is violence, or it's backed by violence, and that's not freedom. So certainly I'm in no way in favor of the state picking its favorites when it comes to business. Companies should be able to compete on their own through their own merits, and that should be that.
Yeah. Well, let's say about one other guy, Ted Cruz. What's your opinion on Ted Cruz?
Again, he's a guy that I haven't heard a lot of hopeful things being said about freedom. I know there are some so-called libertarians out there that tout him as something of a savior. I just don't see it. I think there's somebody like that still favors too many state solutions for problems that would be so much better handled by the free market. So, again, I'm willing to listen, and I say to somebody like Ted Cruz, change my mind, but I'm not too confident that he'll be able to.
Yeah, he's the only one I do kind of. I feel like he's a principled politician. I mean, he really does. He's a very bright guy, very intelligent guy. He does take principled decisions. I don't always agree with him, but he's not a Mitch McConnell. He's not just a, go along to get along. Let's grease everybody's pockets. Let's make sure that we get all the U.S. chamber people aboard for their things. I mean, he actually does seem to take himself, he's not part of the maw in Washington. And therefore, I don't think he has much of a chance as a presidential candidate because he won't attract the big money. But when those mornings I wake up and I feel optimistic, which aren't that many days, I kind of say, well, at least he's following his own path, and he does seem to believe in what he's saying.
Listen, you're probably right, and I don't want to sound completely like a pessimist. I know I'm sort of nixing every politician you bring up, but it's not because I'm a huge pessimist. I'm certainly optimistic about other ways of attaining freedom. I just don't think that the U.S. political system is really set up in a way that will allow people to achieve freedom. I think there are other ways, like we talked about, civil disobedience, certainly peaceful civil disobedience also. Violence, it's just always an excuse for the state to grow larger, and that's a bad idea.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on here earlier in the morning, and it's good to hear your thoughts and viewpoints, and I want to wish you the best of luck.
Oh, thank you so much. I certainly hope people will give Ant Farm a try. People can actually get the first 4 chapters completely free at antfarmbook.com, and then if they like it and they like the ideas of liberty, hopefully they'll check out the rest. It really is applicable to so many of the things we've talked about, and thank you again for having me on the show.
Is it available on Amazon, or do you go to your website to get a hold of it? Where can they get it?
Yeah, it certainly is on Amazon and lots of book retailers, but the easiest way really is just antfarmbook.com because that's where you get the free chapters, and that's also where you can click the link to go directly to the Amazon page as well.
All right, that's great. Well, thanks again for coming on, Stephen.
Thank you.